down, Lieutenant.
Target at 4 kilometers.
Wind is full value left to right. Coriolis is negligible, but the humidity spike is throwing the drag coefficient. Vance, get off the comms. We need air support, not a math lesson. Air is 20 minutes out, Master Chief. You'll be dead in 2. Target is at 3800 meters. Elevation plus 400. That's outside the weapon's effective range by a mile. You fire that round, you give away our position to the entire valley. We are strictly do not engage unless compromised. Stand down, Lieutenant. That is a direct order. They're adjusting the mortar, Chief. Next round hits your extract bird. I have the solution. I said stand down. You take that shot, you're court-martialed before the brass hits the floor. Do you copy? There is a long, static-filled pause. The sound of heavy breathing and the mechanical click of a turret dialing elevation cuts through the noise. I copy, Chief, but I'm not doing it for the brass. Transmission breaks. A deafening singular crack echoes through the valley. 36 hours earlier, Forward Operating Base Keystone, northern Afghanistan. The interior of the C-17 Globemaster was a cavern of shivering steel and red tactical lighting. It smelled of hydraulic fluid, unwashed bodies, and the sharp metallic tang of pure oxygen. Lieutenant Elena Vance sat near the ramp, her body encased in thermal layers and a dry suit, topped with 60 pounds of combat gear. On her lap rested the custom hard case containing the Macmillan TAC-50, a rifle that weighed nearly as much as a small child. She checked the seal on her oxygen mask for the 3rd time in 5 minutes. The hiss of the regulator was the only sound she allowed herself to focus on. Check your anxiety, Lieutenant. You're burning through your O2. The voice crackled over the comms loop, dripping with a bored, gravelly condescension. It was Master Chief Bulldog Rix. He sat across from her, his face obscured by his own mask and NVGs, but she could feel his eyes. They were cold, assessing, and utterly unimpressed. O2 levels are nominal, Master Chief, Elena replied, her voice steady despite the static. Just checking the seal. Don't check. No, Rix shot back. We drop in 10 mics. You drift outside the cone because you're fidgeting, and I leave you in the snow. I don't have the bandwidth to babysit a PR stunt. Elena tightened her grip on her rifle case until her knuckles turned white inside her gloves. PR stunt. That's all she was to them. A girl SEAL, a checkbox for the Department of the Navy to show they were progressive. It didn't matter that she had outshot every instructor at sniper school. It didn't matter that her calculation speed for ballistic trajectories was faster than the PDA strapped to her wrist. To Rix, she was a liability, a fragile thing that would break under the load. Copy that, Master Chief, she said. Arguing was futile. The only currency here was competence. The C-17 banked, the UE vibration rattling through the floorboards and up her spine. The loadmaster, a burly airman tethered to the wall, held up 5 fingers, then 4. 30,000 feet, the pilot's voice came over the net. Ramp opening. The hydraulics whined, screaming in protest as the rear of the plane began to lower. The pressurized air of the cabin rushed out, instantly replaced by the violent, freezing void of the high atmosphere. The temperature plummeted to minus 40 degrees Celsius. The wind noise was a physical assault, a roar that drowned out thought. Team, stand up, Rix barked. Elena hauled herself up. The weight of her ruck and the rifle case pulled at her shoulders, digging straps into her traps. She compensated, shifting her center of gravity forward. She watched the 6 men of the SEAL element move with practiced, ape-like grace toward the edge of the ramp. They were a single organism, a pack. She was the appendage. Sound off. 1, okay. 2, okay. The check moved down the line. When it hit her, she screamed into the mast to be heard over the wind. 7, okay. Rick stopped at the edge of the ramp. The world below was a black abyss, swallowed by the night and the cloud cover. Somewhere down there were the jagged peaks of the Pamir Mountains, and a courier carrying enough viral pathology to wipe out a city. Green light, the loadmaster shouted, waving them forward. Rix didn't hesitate. He stepped into the void. The team followed, one by one, vanishing into the black. Elena stepped to the edge. The wind tore at her goggles. The fear was there. It always was. A primal lizard brain warning that falling was death. She acknowledged it, boxed it, and shoved it aside. She jumped. The slipstream hit her like a sledgehammer. She stabilized instantly, spreading her limbs into a frog position to control the fall. The C-17 roared away above her, leaving her alone in the freezing dark. She checked her altimeter on her wrist. 28,000 feet. She pulled the ripcord. The chute cracked open, jerking her harness violently. The roar of the wind vanished, replaced by the eerie, hissing silence of the glide. She looked down, toggling her night vision. Below, the mountains were white teeth waiting to chew them up. She scanned for the IR strobes of the team. 1, 2, 5. She counted 6. Rix was at the point. She checked her navigation board. The wind at this altitude was stronger than the briefing had predicted. It was pushing the team dangerously close to the eastern ridge, the no-go zone where Chinese radar installations might pick up a signature. "Chief," Elena keyed her mic, breaking radio silence. "Viper, check your vector. High-altitude winds are drifting us east. Correct 5 degrees west, or we clip the radar net." Silence. "Chief, did you copy?" "I have the vector, Vance," Rix snapped, though she saw his canopy tilt. He was correcting. He just didn't want to admit she was right. "Maintain silence. Feet dry and 2 mics." Elena adjusted her toggles, steering her chute to follow the formation. She looked at the massive expanse of snow and rock below. They were dropping into hell, led by a man who wanted her gone, to find an enemy who wanted them dead. She checked her landing zone. A small plateau surrounded by jagged scree. It was going to be a hard landing. "Welcome to the show, Elena," she thought. "Don't break a leg." As the ground rushed up to meet her, she flared the chute. Her boots crunched into deep, frozen crust, and she performed a PLF, parachute landing fall, rolling to absorb the impact. The rifle case slammed into the snow next to her. She lay there for a second, heart hammering, listening. The wind howled through the peaks. No alarms, no gunfire. She unclipped her harness, grabbed the rifle case, and brought her carbine up, scanning the dark. A figure materialized out of the snow 10 meters away. Rix. He loomed over her, his suppressed rifle pointed at the ground, his face a green glowing mask in her NVGs. "You're heavy," he whispered, not a question. "I'm operational," she whispered back, standing up and shouldering the weight. "We'll see," Rix said, turning his back on her to signal the team forward. "Move out. We have 10 clicks to the target. Try to keep up, Girl Scout." Elena watched him go, jaw set. She checked the chamber of her rifle. "Walk fast, Chief," she thought. "You're going to need me before the sun comes up." The snow in the Pamirs wasn't like the powder at a ski resort. It was a crusty, unforgiving layer of ice sitting atop 3 feet of unstable drift. With every step, Elena's boot broke through the crust, crunch, and sank to her shin, requiring a concerted effort of her quads and hip flexors to rip it back out. It was called post-holing, and doing it with 100 pounds of gear at 12,000 feet was a specific kind of torture designed to separate the weak from the elite. Master Chief Rix set a pace that bordered on sadistic. The 6 men of the assault element moved in a phalanx of white over whites, their movements efficient and robotic. They were acclimatized, strong, and fueled by a collective testosterone that seemed to repel the cold. Elena, despite her training, felt the altitude wrapping its fingers around her lungs. Every breath through her balaclava felt insufficient. The oxygen molecules too spread out to satisfy her screaming muscles. She grit her teeth, tasting the metallic tang of exertion. She would not fall behind. She would die before she created a gap in the formation. Through the quad tubes of her GPNVG-18s, the world was a surreal, washed-out green landscape. The panoramic night vision gave her a wide field of view, turning the jagged peaks surrounding them into ghostly sentinels. The silence was absolute, broken only by the rhythmic crunch of boots in the wind whistling through the rocky passes. "Hold!" Rix's voice cut through the comms, barely a whisper. The column froze instantly. Elena dropped to one knee, bringing her HK-416 up, scanning her sector to the left. The massive case of the Macmillan TAC-50 strapped to her back shifted, throwing her balance off for a microsecond. She corrected, annoyed at the clumsiness. Rix moved down the line, checking the men. He stopped at Elena. She couldn't see his eyes behind his goggles, but she felt the judgment radiating off him like heat. "You breathing heavy, Vance?" "Negative, Chief," she lied, forcing her respiration rate to slow, holding the air in her lungs until they burned. "You're dragging your feet. I can hear the scuffing," Rix murmured, his voice devoid of sympathy. "We're burning daylight we don't have. If you can't hump the load, drop the 50. We'll blow it in place." "The rifle stays with me," Elena said, her voice hard. "I'm good." "Then prove it. Get to the rear," Rix ordered. "Take rear security. I don't want you tripping up the breach team when we hit the village. You watch our 6, and stay off the net unless you see the Yeti." It was a demotion. Rear security was vital, but in this context, it was a leash. He was putting her in the nursery so the adults could work. "Copy," Elena said. She waited for the team to shuffle past her, taking her place at the very end of the snake. They moved out again. The pace increased. From the back, Elena had a different view. She watched the team move, noting the small micro-adjustments they made to the terrain. They were excellent, she had to admit. Lethal, quiet, disciplined. But their focus was singular. Forward. They were hunters locking on to a scent, tunnel-visioned on the objective. The village nestled in the valley 5 clicks north. Elena's mind, however, worked differently. It was a chaotic processor of variables. Wind speed, barometric pressure, angles of incidence. It was what made her a prodigy with a long gun, but it also made her paranoid. She didn't just look, she calculated. As they crested a small ridge, the wind picked up, swirling snow around them like a dense fog. The visibility dropped. The team pushed on, Rix relentless in his pursuit of the timeline. Elena paused for a split second, turning her head to scan the ridgeline parallel to their movement, about 2 kilometers to the east. It was a jagged spine of black rock against the lighter gray of the sky. Something didn't fit the pattern. It wasn't a heat signature. Thermal wouldn't pick up much at this distance in this cold, unless it was a vehicle. It was a disruption in the starlight, a silhouette that was too smooth, too geometric to be rock. She blinked, focusing her tubes. The object was hovering, drifting slightly with the wind currents, then correcting itself. It was small, maybe the size of a hawk. A bird? No. Birds didn't hover in a blizzard at night. She watched it for 3 seconds. It banked, a tiny glint of reflection catching the ambient light of the moon. "Chief," Elena whispered, breaking her order to stay off the net. "Maintain silence, Vance," Rix hissed immediately. "Contact left, high, ridge line, 2 clicks." The column didn't stop, but she saw the heads of the 2 men in front of her turn. "I see nothing on thermal," the point man reported. "You seeing ghosts, Viper?" "It's cold," Elena insisted, her eyes locked on the object. "Composite body, fixed wing, small UAS. It's a spotter drone." "There's no chatter on the scanners," the comms specialist interjected. "If there was a drone, we'd pick up the control link." "Not if it's running a pre-programmed waypoint loop," Elena argued, her pulse quickening. "Passive recon. They know we're coming, or they're looking for something." "Vance, move your ass," Rix ordered. "We are not stopping for a bird. Intel says the area is clear of tech-capable hostiles. These are smugglers, not state actors." "The flight pattern is grid search," Elena pressed, ignoring the insubordination. "Chief, if that's a drone, the element of surprise is gone." "I said move!" Elena watched the object for 1 more second as it dipped below the ridgeline, vanishing into the dark. It wasn't a bird. She knew the math of flight. Well, that thing was artificial. She turned and jogged to catch up with the team, the heavy rifle slamming against her spine. A cold knot formed in her stomach, colder than the freezing air. Rix was operating on the intel he had been given. Smugglers, low tech, quick grab. But Elena trusted her eyes. They were walking into a jar, and someone had just put the lid on. "Copy, moving," she whispered into the mic. She checked the safety on her HK-4116, flicking it off, then back on. A nervous tick. She kept her head on a swivel, checking the 6, then the 3, then the 9. The mountains felt different now. They weren't just empty rock and ice. They felt occupied. The team descended into the valley floor, the terrain flattening out. Up ahead, the faint, warm glow of fires from the village flickered like dying stars. The separation was the hardest part, not physically. Elena was used to the burn in her legs, but psychologically. As Master Chief Rick signaled for the assault team to move low into the wadi that fed into the village, he gestured for her to break off. A single, sharp knife hand pointed toward the looming granite shelf 800 meters to the east. "Get up top. Eyes on. Don't engage unless we're compromised," Rix had whispered, his voice devoid of warmth. "And Vance, don't miss." Now she was alone. The silence of the Pamirs was heavy, pressing in on her eardrums. She moved slowly up the scree slope, every step a calculated placement of boots to avoid dislodging loose rock. Sound carried for miles in this thin air. Reaching the shelf, she didn't just flop down. She crawled the last 20 yards on her stomach, dragging the rifle bag through the snow. She found a depression between two boulders, a natural wind tunnel, but it offered a perfect line of sight into the village below. She unpacked the Macmillan TAC-50 with the reverence of a surgeon preparing instruments. The rifle was a beast, modified with a shorter barrel for portability that barely made a difference to its massive bulk. She unfolded the bipod, seated the stock into her shoulder, and pulled the thermal blanket over her head in the scope, breaking up her silhouette. She was now just another lump of snow-covered rock. "Sierra 1 in position," she whispered. "Radio check." "Copy, Sierra 1. 5 by 5, the comms specialist replied. "Team is at the breach point. Stand by." Elena exhaled, her breath fogging the air inside her small enclosure. She pulled out her Kestrel 5700 Elite weather meter and held it up slightly. The little fan spun lazily. Temperature, Narnshoritudor at 18 degrees C. Barometric pressure, 20.1 in H/G. Wind, 40 mi from the north, full value. Simple math. Easy shots. She settled behind the Leupold Mark 8 optic, dialing the magnification down to scan the village. Through the glass, the world was crisp and terrifyingly intimate. The village was a cluster of mud brick compounds surrounded by a low wall. A few goats huddled in a pen. Smoke curled from a central chimney. It looked peaceful. Too peaceful. "I have visual on the target building," Elena reported, her voice flat. "Compound north. 2 sentries at the gate, armed with AKs, slung, smoking. They look relaxed." "Copy," Rix replied. "Moving to breach." Elena panned the scope left, sweeping the perimeter. Her eyes narrowed. She spotted a heat signature behind a low wall on the western flank. Then another. Then 2 more on a rooftop that should have been empty. "Hold," she said, urgency creeping into her tone. "Chief, I'm counting 4. No, 5 additional packs on the west side. They aren't local militia. They're wearing plate carriers." "Intel said light security," Rix growled. "Are you sure, Vance?" Elena adjusted the focus. The figure on the roof turned. She saw the distinct outline of a PKM machine gun on a bipod, set up to sweep the exact courtyard the SEALs were about to enter. Positive ID. Heavy weapon on the roof. PKM. West side. "Chief, that's a kill zone. They're set up for an ambush." There was a pause. She could imagine Rix hesitating, weighing her word against the mission profile. "Copy. We'll adjust entry to the east wall," Rix said. "Keep scanning. Find the courier." Elena shifted her aim to the main house. Through a window, she saw movement. A figure paced back and forth, tall, wearing a heavy coat. The courier. But he wasn't alone. He was arguing with someone, a man in tactical gear who was gesturing violently. "Wait," she zoomed in. The man in tactical gear wasn't arguing. He was checking his watch. He looked expectant. Elena's stomach dropped. The drone she had seen earlier. The heavy weapons positioned specifically covering the breach points. The relaxed sentries at the front who were clearly bait. "Chief, abort," she said, her voice rising. "This isn't a smuggling run, it's a trap. The sentries are decoys. I see a prepared fighting position on the—" Screak! A high-pitched squeal erupted in her earpiece, deafening her. She ripped the butt out of her ear, wincing. "Chief, say again?" "Break, break. Chief!" Static. White noise. She looked at her radio. The display was scrambling. Jamming? Or just the atmospheric anomaly of the mountains? She toggled the frequency. Nothing but hiss. Below, in the dark valley, she saw the IR strobes of her team stacking up on the east wall. The wall she had just told them was safe. But as she panned her scope right, she saw the trap springing shut. On the ridge directly opposite her position and directly above the seals, a camouflage net was thrown back. It wasn't a PKM. It was a mortar tube. And next to it, a team of men were already dropping a round down the pipe. "No!" she screamed into the dead air. She didn't have a shot. The angle was wrong. A rock outcropping blocked her line of fire to the mortar team. She was helpless. Below, a flash of light bloomed on the east wall as the SEALs blew the breach charge. The explosion was silent from this distance for a split second. Then the crump reached her. Simultaneously, the mortar on the far ridge fired. Thump. She watched the trajectory in horror. The mortar round wasn't aiming for the SEALs. It was aiming for the cliff face above them. The round impacted the snow-laden slope. An avalanche of rock and ice shuddered loose, cascading down toward the team's entry point. "Contact! Contact!" she yelled, knowing no one could hear her. The village erupted. The relaxed sentries dropped prone and opened fire. The PKM on the roof lit up the night with green tracers. The SEALs were bottled up in the alley, debris raining down on them, cut off from their exit. Elena slammed her hand against the frozen ground. They were pinned, no comms, outnumbered, and she was the only one who could see the full shape of the slaughter. She grabbed the bolt of her rifle, racking around into the chamber. The smooth, mechanical clack-clack was the only thing that made sense in the chaos. "Do your job, Viper," she told herself. "Do the math." She settled the crosshairs on the PKM gunner on the roof. Range, 840 meters. Wind, hold left, 0.4 mils. She exhaled. Trigger. The recoil of the TAC-50 was a violent shove against Elena's shoulder, a physical confirmation of physics in action. Through the scope, the result was clinical. The PKM gunner on the roof folded backward, his weapon clattering silently to the courtyard below. A pink mist hung in the air for a fraction of a second before the wind tore it apart. "Target down," she whispered to herself, the habit of communication hardwired even when the radio was dead. Below, the valley floor had turned into a chaotic light show. The avalanche triggered by the mortar round had cut off the team's primary extraction route, piling tons of snow and rock across the eastern pass. The SEALs were committed now. There was no going back. Through her optic, she watched the 6 white-clad figures stacking up on the main door of the target compound. They moved with a terrifying fluidity, ignoring the debris raining down around them. Breaching charges were slapped onto the heavy wooden gate. "Don't go in," Elena pleaded silently, her eye burning as she strained to find threats in the darkness. "It's too easy." A flash of white light bloomed on the gate, the breaching charge detonating. The heavy wood splintered inward. 2 flashbangs were tossed in immediately after. Bang, bang! The team flowed into the room like water. Elena shifted her aim, scanning the windows of the second floor. She saw movement, a silhouette popping up with an RPG. She didn't think. She didn't breathe. She just calculated. Range 8 at 20, angle steep, lead slightly low, crack. The RPG gunner spun, the rocket launcher falling inside the room. A dull explosion blew the windows out from the inside as the warhead detonated prematurely. But there were too many of them. Down in the courtyard, the assault team had reached the main room. Elena could see through the large, blown-out bay window. Master Chief Rix was in the lead. He moved toward the figure she had identified as the courier, the man in the heavy coat standing by the table. Rix grabbed the figure's shoulder to spin him around. The figure toppled over, stiff, unbending. It was a mannequin, a decoy dressed in rags and stuffed with straw. Elena felt the blood drain from her face. The realization hit her with the force of a physical blow. The intel wasn't just wrong, it had been fed to them. This wasn't an interception, it was an execution. Suddenly, the perimeter wall of the compound erupted. It wasn't a mortar this time. It was a daisy chain of IEDs buried in the mud walls. The explosion was massive, lifting the entire southern flank of the compound and throwing it inward. Dust and smoke instantly obscured the thermal view. "Team, break contact!" Elena screamed into the dead mic, her voice cracking. She racked the bolt of the .50 caliber, ejecting a smoking brass casing into the snow. She slammed the bolt forward. She couldn't see them. The dust cloud was too thick even for the thermal sensors to penetrate effectively. Then, the wind shifted, dragging the smoke veil aside. The courtyard was a ruin. The seals were scrambling, dragging two of their own toward the cover of a livestock trough. They were alive, but they were pinned. The enemy fire was intensifying, pouring down from the surrounding ridges. It was a classic L-shaped ambush, plunging fire into a low-ground kill zone. The mortar on the far ridge fired again. Thump. Elena watched the round arc through the sky. She tracked it, helpless. It landed 50 meters short of the team, blowing a crater in the frozen mud. They were walking the rounds in. Bracket fire. One long, one short, then split. The middle for effect. The next round would be on top of them. "I need to suppress that mortar," Elena hissed. She swung the massive rifle toward the distant ridge where the mortar team was set up. She dialed the elevation turret. Click, click, click. The range was extreme, nearly 4 kilometers. Her scope was maxed out. The target was a fuzzy blob of heat on the very edge of her reticle. She checked the kestrel. The wind was gusting, unpredictable. At this distance, the bullet would be in the air for over 4 seconds. The Coriolis effect, the rotation of the Earth, would actually move the target before the bullet arrived. It was a Hail Mary, a prayer in .50 caliber. She centered the crosshairs, holding high and right, guessing the wind drift. She squeezed the trigger. The rifle roared. The shock wave kicked up a cloud of snow around her hide. She stayed on the glass, counting. 1, 2, 3, 4. A puff of snow erupted on the ridge, 50 meters to the left of the mortar team. A miss. A massive miss. The physics were against her. The barrel length, the temperature of the powder, the humidity, everything was conspiring to make the shot impossible. "Damn it," she cursed, slamming her hand against the frozen earth. She looked back at the village. The SEALs were returning fire, their suppressed carbines sounding like staplers against the heavy thud, thud, thud of the enemy machine guns. They were moving, bounding backward, trying to get to a depression in the ground, a dried-up riverbed that offered the only cover. But the mortar team was adjusting. She saw them turning the crank on the tube. They were going to finish it. Elena grabbed her radio, switching to the emergency distress frequency, the one that broadcasted in the clear, unencrypted. It was a suicide move. Every enemy listener would hear her. But she had no choice. Any station, she yelled. "This is Viper 1-1. Troop in contact, grid 48 Sierra Tango. Immediate air support requested. We are effectively surrounded." Static. Then a voice cut through. Not American. "We hear you, little bird." The voice was thick, accented, and laughing. They were jamming the specific frequencies, but they were listening to the open ones. They knew she was there. Elena stared at the radio, then at the ridge. She was alone. The team was dying, and the only weapon she had that could reach the enemy was a rifle that couldn't hit the target. She looked down at the team again. Rix was dragging the point man. He looked up directly at her position on the mountain. He waved his arm frantically. "Get out!" He was ordering her to flee. Elena looked at him, then at the mortar. She dialed her scope back down. "Not today, Chief," she whispered. "Not today." She settled back behind the rifle. She wasn't going to run. She was going to have to do something she had never done before. She was going to have to guess. So the valley floor was no longer a tactical environment. It was a slaughterhouse. From her perch 800 meters above, Elena watched the destruction unfold with a detached, sickening clarity. The view through her Leupold scope was like watching a silent film of a catastrophe. The muzzle flashes from the surrounding ridges were relentless, a ring of fire tightening around the 6 men trapped in the snow below. The SEALs were moving, or trying to. They had abandoned the ruins of the compound, pushing toward a depression in the terrain, a dried-up wadi that offered the only defilade from the direct fire. But the enemy had anticipated this. A heavy machine gun, a DSHK 12.7mm judging by the rhythmic, heavy thump that reached Elena seconds after the flashes, opened up from the northern cliff face. The rounds didn't just hit the ground. They exploded into the frozen earth, throwing up geysers of rock and ice. "Move, move, move!" Elena screamed into her dead mic, her hands gripping the rifle so hard her gloves creaked. She watched the point man throw an M18 smoke grenade. A cloud of thick, gray, phosphorus smoke billowed out, momentarily shielding the team from the naked eye. But the enemy on the ridges wasn't aiming with eyes. They were spraying the area with calculating cruelty. The SEALs dove into the wadi. It was shallow, barely 3 feet of cover. They pressed themselves into the frozen mud, curling into fetal balls as supersonic rounds cracked inches above their heads. They were pinned, completely and utterly fixed in place. Elena scanned the enemy positions. They were too far. The DSHK was 2 kilometers out. The mortar team she had missed was nearly 4. Her team's HK-416s, optimized for close quarters battle with an effective range of maybe 600 meters, were useless. They were spitting pebbles at a mountain. Then she saw him. Master Chief Rix was on his knees near the rear of the formation, exposing himself above the lip of the wadi to lay down suppressive fire. He was trying to buy his men seconds to reload. It was a suicide move, born of desperate bravery. Through her optic, Elena saw the impact before she heard it. A round caught Rix in the chest. It wasn't a clean hole. The kinetic energy of the heavy caliber round lifted the big man off his feet and threw him backward into the snow as if he had been kicked by a mule. "Chief!" The team crumbled. 2 SEALs abandoned their cover, scrambling back to grab him. They dragged his limp body into the depression, leaving a streak of dark blood on the white snow that looked black in the moonlight. The momentum was gone. The team stopped trying to break out. They huddled around Rix, applying tourniquets, checking vitals. They had transitioned from a fighting force to a rescue detail. And in combat, that was the beginning of the end. The enemy sensed it. The rate of fire increased. The noose tightened. Elena felt a wave of nausea. The man who had mocked her, who had called her a liability, was now bleeding. Out in a ditch because he didn't have the air support she had promised was impossible. She looked back at the mortar position on the far ridge. The crew was working efficiently, adjusting the bipod legs of the tube. They had seen the smoke. They knew exactly where the SEALs were hiding. Thump! Another round in the air. Elena tracked it. It landed 20 meters from the wadi, blowing the edge of the bank apart. Closer. They were walking the rounds in. The next adjustment would put a high explosive round directly into the depression, turning the team into hamburger meat. She looked at her rifle. The barrel was still warm from the failed shot. The math was impossible. The distance was absurd. But down there, the alpha males, the Tier 1 operators, the invincible warriors, were huddled together, waiting to die. They had no air. They had no comms. They had no exit. They only had her. Elena forced her breathing to slow. She forced the image of Rix's broken body out of her mind. She needed to be a computer, not a human. She reached into her pocket and pulled out her waterproof notebook and a grease pencil. She couldn't guess again. Guessing got people killed. She had to solve the equation. She looked at the mortar team, then at the flags of snow whipping off the peaks. She looked at the moon. She looked at the angle of the slope. Range, 3,800 meters. Altitude, 12,500 feet. Temperature, dropping. She began to write, her hands shaking not from cold, but from the terrifying realization that she was about to attempt a shot that physics said shouldn't happen. "Hold on," she whispered to the men who couldn't hear her. "Just hold on." Down in the wadi, the radio operator looked up, scanning the ridgeline, his face a mask of hopelessness. He was looking for a helicopter that wasn't coming. He didn't look at her position. He had forgotten she was there. To them, she was already gone. Elena dialed the elevation turret on her scope until it stopped. Maxed out. It wasn't enough. She would have to hold over, aiming at a point in the empty sky above the target, trusting the bullet to fall into the existence of the enemy. She settled in. The cold was biting through her suit, but she didn't feel it. All she felt was the weight of 6 lives resting on her trigger finger. The world narrowed down to a series of numbers glowing faintly on the small screen of Elena's ballistic computer. Range, 3,912 meters. Elevation, 430 feet. Temperature, 20 centigrade. Barometric pressure, 19.8 Nh. Elena stared at the data, her brain processing the variables faster than her frozen fingers could input them. The distance was grotesque. In the sniper community, anything over 2,000 meters was considered a poke, a lucky shot that required perfect conditions. She was attempting nearly double that at night in a blizzard with a target that was actively moving. She adjusted the elevation turret on the Leupold Mark 8 scope. Click, 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 the turret bottomed out. It stopped turning. She cursed softly. The scope physically couldn't dial enough elevation to account for the bullet drop. At 3,800 meters, the 50 caliber projectile would fall hundreds of feet before it reached the target. She was trying to lob a piece of lead over a mountain range. She would have to hold over. She would have to aim not at the enemy, but at a patch of empty black sky high above the ridgeline, trusting the bullet to arc down into the mortar team. "Come on, think," she hissed, closing her eyes for a second to visualize the trajectory. It wasn't just gravity, it was the rotation of the Earth, the Coriolis effect. Because she was firing north, the Earth would spin right beneath the bullet during its flight, causing the round to impact slightly to the right of where she aimed. She had to compensate left. Then there was spin drift. The bullet spinning clockwise would naturally drift right. More compensation left. She keyed the numbers into the Kestrel again. The wind meter spun erratically. 8 chakyap, then 12, then 4. The wind in the mountains wasn't a river. It was a turbulence chamber. It swirled, downdrafted, and eddied around the peaks. "Keystone, this is Viper 1-1. Radio check," she whispered, praying the altitude gave her a line of sight to the satellite. A burst of static, then a voice. Faint, ghostly, but there. "Viper. Read you. Broken. Sitrep." It was the JOC, Joint Operations Center. The signal was bouncing off the stratosphere, skipping the local jamming. "Troop in contact," Elena said, her voice trembling with the adrenaline dump. "Heavy casualties. We are pinned by indirect fire. I have a solution on the enemy mortar team. Range extreme. Request permission to engage." There was a pause, a long, agonizing silence, where she could hear the thump-thump of the DSHK below chewing up the earth around her dying teammates. "Viper, copy range extreme. Do you have positive identification? Can you confirm no civilians in the splash zone?" "Negative on civilians. It's a hostile ridge. But I cannot PID faces at this distance. It is a crew-served weapon." "Stand by." Elena looked through the scope. The mortar crew was loading another round. They were adjusting the T&E mechanism. They were dialing in the final correction to wipe out the Wadi. "Viper, this is Keystone. Negative. Repeat, negative on engagement. Distance is outside effective range. High risk of collateral or cross-border incident. You are do not engage unless you have clear PID. Maintain observation. Air is 30 mics out. 30 minutes. Ricks would be dead in 2. "They don't have 30 minutes, Elena shouted, forgetting discipline. "They are bracketed." "Maintain discipline, Lieutenant. That is a direct order." "Acknowledged?" Elena stared at the radio. The order was clear, lawful, logical. From a tactical standpoint, firing a 50 caliber round almost 4 kilometers based on a math equation was insanity. If she missed and hit a village across the border, she started an international incident. If she fired and missed, she gave away her position and the DSHK would turn on her, shredding her lonely perch. She looked down at the Wadi. She saw the faint IR strobe on Rix's chest. It was pulsing slowly, fading. She looked at the wind flags she had mentally marked, the snow blowing off a jagged peak, the sway of a lone pine tree halfway down the valley. The computer said the wind hold was 4.5 mils left, but Elena felt a sudden gust hit her cheek. It was cold, sharp, and it smelled of ozone. The computer was reacting to the wind here, at her position. But down there, in the mid-range of the bullet's flight, the wind was doing something else. The valley was sucking air in. The math said 4.5. Her gut screamed 6. If she listened to the order, she kept her career. She stayed a SEAL. She proved she could follow the chain of command. If she took the shot, she was a rogue operator, a liability. She looked at the mortar tube. The loader dropped the round in. Thump! The explosion down in the valley was close. Too close. The radio operator's scream cut through the static in her earpiece before the signal died again. Elena reached up and turned off her radio volume. The voice of command vanished. She was alone with the wind. She settled her cheek against the stock of the TAC-50. She ignored the computer's firing solution. She ignored the flashing red numbers. She looked at the empty sky above the ridge. She shifted her aim further left, past the computer's recommendation, into the realm of pure intuition. 6 mils, she whispered. Full value. Her heart rate slowed. The terrifying variables, the spin of the earth, the density of the air, the chaotic wind, stopped being problems and became parts of a symphony she had to conduct. She wasn't a girl. She wasn't a liability. She was the only thing standing between her team and the dark. She exhaled, emptying her lungs until there was nothing left but stillness. The silence was a physical weight. By cutting the radio audio, Elena had severed the tether to the world of rules, ranks, and repercussions. There was no Joint Operations Center. There was no Master Chief Ricks. There was no Navy. There was only the reticle, the wind, and the beat of her own heart. Lub-dub, lub-dub. It was too fast. 110 beats per minute. Too fast for a shot of this magnitude. If she squeezed the trigger at the peak of a beat, the micro tremor in her arterial pulse would throw the muzzle off by a fraction of a millimeter. At nearly 4 kilometers, that fraction translated to missing the target by the length of a bus. She needed to lower her heart rate. In the middle of a firefight, while her friends were bleeding out 800 meters below, she had to find a state of absolute monk-like zen. She closed her eyes for a microsecond. She pictured the ocean. Dark, cold, heavy. She let the image wash over. The panic smoothing out the spikes of adrenaline. Lub, dub, lub, dub. 90 beats. 80. She opened her eyes. The world came back in high definition, but detached. The view through the scope was no longer a battlefield. It was a geometry problem. The enemy mortar team on the distant ridge were variables in an equation she had just solved with her gut. She checked the bubble level on her scope ring. Perfectly centered. If the rifle was canted even 1 degree to the left or right, the bullet would veer wildly off course. She slid her index finger into the trigger guard. The metal was freezing, biting through the thin fabric of her shooting glove. "This is it, Elena," a voice in the back of her head whispered. "You pull this trigger and you never wear the trident again. You go to Leavenworth. You become the cautionary tale." The rules of engagement were black and white. Do not fire unless fired upon or positive identification is confirmed. She had neither. She was firing on a hunch at a blob of heat into a sovereign nation that wasn't technically part of the war zone. She thought of Ricks, lying in the snow, his chest shattered. She thought of the letter she would have to write to his wife if she did nothing. "I followed orders, Mrs. Ricks. I watched him die because the radio told me to." No, she applied pressure to the trigger. The Macmillan TAC-50 had a crisp 3-pound break. She took up the slack. 1 pound. The wall. She reached the respiratory pause. That bottom of the exhale where the body is most stable, where the lungs are empty and the diaphragm is still. Wind is 6 mils left. Hold high. Send it. She didn't pull the trigger. She pressed it straight back, a smooth, continuous increase in pressure until the machine surprised her. Crack. The break was clean. The firing pin slammed forward, striking the primer of the 50 caliber Raufo's Mk211 round. The explosion that followed was a controlled catastrophe. The muzzle brake on the end of the barrel vented the expanding gases backward and to the sides to mitigate the recoil. But the physics of a 50 BMG were undeniable. The rifle slammed into Elena's shoulder with the force of a car crash. The scope kicked back toward her eye. Dust and snow erupted around the muzzle, momentarily blinding her thermal view. The sound was a thunderclap that rolled through the peaks, louder than the enemy mortar, louder than the wind. But for Elena, the world had gone silent again. The recoil impulse traveled through her body, jarring her teeth, rattling her skull. But she didn't flinch. She rode the recoil, keeping her body straight, fighting to get the scope back on target. This was the most critical moment. The follow-through. If she jerked her head up to look, she would lose the trace. She forced her eye to stay welded to the optic, blinking through the recoil. The image in the scope settled. The rifle was empty. The brass casing was still in the chamber. The bullet was gone. It was no longer her. Responsibility. It was a separate entity now. A copper-jacketed messenger traveling at supersonic speeds across the valley of death. She held her breath. She didn't rack the bolt. She didn't move. She just watched the empty air above the distant ridge. The waiting was the torture. At 300-800 meters, the time of flight, TOF, was excruciating. 1,000. The bullet was spinning at thousands of revolutions per second, fighting the drag of the air. 1,000. It began to drop. Gravity grabbed it, pulling it down from the apex of its arc. It was falling now, plunging toward the earth like a meteor. 1,000. The wind at the mid-valley floor grabbed it. Was her guess right? Did she hold enough left? Or was the round currently drifting harmlessly into a snowbank, cementing her failure? 1,000. She felt a tear leak from her eye, freezing instantly on her cheek. Not from sadness, from the sheer, unadulterated terror of the unknown. 5. The bullet was transonic now. It was destabilizing as it slowed down, shuddering as it crossed the sound barrier. Elena Vance lay in the snow, a criminal, a savior, a ghost. She watched the distant ridge, waiting for the universe to tell her if she was a hero or a fool. 5.2 seconds. That was the theoretical flight time. Elena's internal clock had ticked past 5. The bullet should have arrived. Through the high magnification glass of the Leupold Mark 8, the enemy ridge remained stubbornly unchanged. The mortar crew was still there, a cluster of thermal ghosts in the monochrome green display. The loader was still reaching for the tube. The gunner was still cranking the handle. She had missed. The realization hit her like a bucket of ice water. The wind had pushed it too far, or the air density was lower than the Kestrel predicted, or the spin drift was aggressive. It didn't matter why. The result was the same. She had gambled the lives of her team on a math problem, and she had failed. She took a breath to scream, to rack the bolt, to do something, when the laws of physics finally caught up with the present moment. The image in the scope didn't just change, it disintegrated. She hadn't hit the gunner. The variables had drifted the bullet right, pushing it past the man's torso, but she had been using the Raufoss Mk211 round, a high-explosive, incendiary armor-piercing projectile designed to disable light vehicles and ignite fuel. The bullet had drifted past the gunner and slammed directly into the stack of 82mm mortar shells sitting exposed on the rock shelf next to the tube. The Raufoss tip ignited on impact. The tungsten penetrator cored through the casing of the top shell. The incendiary charge detonated. A white-hot sphere of thermal violence bloomed on the distant ridge. It wasn't a small puff of dirt. It was a secondary detonation of the enemy's entire ammunition supply. The explosion was silent to Elena's ears. Light travels instantly. Sound drags its feet. She watched in awe as the fireball consumed the mortar team. The heavy steel tube was tossed into the air like a discarded toy, cartwheeling against the night sky before vanishing over the cliff edge. The thermal signatures of the crew were erased instantly, replaced by the washing-out bloom of extreme heat that blinded her night vision for a full second. Impact, she breathed, the words shuddering out of her. She waited. The valley remained quiet. The explosion had happened nearly 4 kilometers away. The sound wave was still traveling, clawing its way through the thin frozen air at 340 meters per second. She kept her eye on the scope. The bloom faded. The dust settled. Where the mortar pit had been, there was only a black, smoking crater. No movement, no DSHK fire. The heavy machine gunner, positioned 10 meters away from the mortar, had likely been incapacitated by the overpressure or the shrapnel from the cooking-off rounds. Then, 10 seconds later, it arrived. Boom. The sound rolled over her position, a deep, crumping thud that echoed off the canyon walls, followed by the sharper cracks of the cooking-off ammunition. Down in the wadi, the effect was immediate. The DSHK fire had stopped. The valley floor fell into a stunned, ringing silence. Elena dialed her magnification back, scanning down to the riverbed. The SEALs were still huddled in the depression, heads down, waiting for the mortar round that never came. They flinched when the sound of the explosion reached them, looking around in confusion. One of them, she thought it was Tex, the breach specialist, poked his head up, looking toward the enemy ridge, then up at the sky. He was looking for a plane. He was looking for the Predator drone or the F-18 that had just dropped a J-Dime to save them. He didn't look at the mountain. He didn't look at her. "Keystone, this is Viper," Elena said, reaching up to turn her volume knob back on. Her hand was shaking uncontrollably now, the adrenaline dump crashing into her system. "Target neutralized. Secondary containment breach. Enemy heavy weapons are down." The static hissed. Then a voice broke through. It wasn't the JOS. It was the radio operator in the Wadi. "Viper, was that air?" "Negative," Elena replied, her voice sounding foreign to her own ears, rasping and hollow. "That was me." There was a long silence on the net. "Say again, Viper. You are 4 clicks out. You're saying you hit a mortar pit with a rifle from 4 clicks?" "I'm saying the mortar is gone," Elena said, wiping the freezing sweat from her eyes. "Move. You have a window. Get the chief to extract. I'll cover the rear." She watched them through the scope. For a moment, nobody moved. They looked up toward her position, tiny pixels of white in the vast darkness. The skepticism was palpable even from this distance. They didn't believe her. They couldn't. It was physically impossible. But the mortar was burning. The DSK was silent, and they were alive. "Copy, Viper," the operator said. His tone shifted. It wasn't the dismissive tone from the briefing. It was confused, hesitant, and laced with a dawn of terrifying respect. "Moving to extract. Cover us." Elena watched them scramble up the bank of the Wadi, dragging Ricks on a skid. They moved fast, energized by the miracle. She didn't move. She couldn't. Her shoulder throbbed with a dull ache where the stock had bitten her. Her right eye felt bruised. She laid her head down on the cold stock of the rifle, just for a second, listening to the wind howl. She had done it. She had broken every rule, defied the laws of probability, and saved them. But as she lay there, a new sound cut through the wind. Not the crack of a rifle or the thump of a mortar. It was the low, angry buzz of engines. Elena lifted her head, scanning the sky. The drone she had seen earlier, the spotter. It hadn't left. It was circling. And now that she had fired, now that she had lit up the night with the muzzle flash of a .50 caliber Dragon, it knew exactly where she was. She wasn't the hunter anymore. She was the prey. The buzz of the drone was the dinner bell. Elena didn't wait for the first round to impact. She knew the drill. The muzzle flash of the TAC-50 in the pitch-black mountains would have looked like a camera flash in a darkroom. The drone had geotagged her coordinates, and every surviving fighter in the valley was now looking up. "Viper, you are compromised," the radio crackled. "We see movement on the ridge to your east. QRF is moving on you. Estimated time to contact. 2 mics." Elena scrambled backward, crabbing away from the edge of the cliff. She grabbed the drag handle of the rifle bag. It was dead weight, 25 pounds of steel and polymer that felt like 100. "Leave it!" her survival instinct screamed. "Disable the bolt, smash the optic, and run." "No," her pride answered. "It saved us." She hauled the weapon onto her back, the straps digging into her bruised shoulders. She rolled onto her stomach and slid down the backside of the scree slope, just as the rock shelf she had been lying on disintegrated under a hail of machine gun fire. Crack, thump, crack, thump. The rounds were close. The enemy was closing the distance faster than she could move in the deep snow. She was a sniper, a master of stillness, but this was a foot race, and she was already losing. She hit a patch of ice and lost her footing, tumbling 10 meters down a jagged chute. She slammed into a pine tree, the air rushing out of her lungs in a painful wheeze. She lay there for a second, staring up at the canopy, black spots dancing in her vision. Her leg throbbed. The rifle case had twisted, wrenching her back. "Keystone, Viper is moving to alternate extract," she gasped into the mic, forcing herself up. She drew her SIG P226 sidearm, It felt absurdly small against the vastness of the threat. Negative, Viper. Alternate extract is burned, the radio operator's voice came back, urgent but calm. We are moving to you. Elena froze. Say again? We are moving to you. Hold your position. We're coming up the wadi. Negative, Elena screamed. Get the chief out. You have a clear path to the LZ. Do not come back for me. That is a direct order. We don't take orders from support assets. A different voice cut in. It was strained, breathless, and wet with pain. Rix. Chief? Shut up and keep your head down, Vance, Rix wheezed. We leave no one behind, not even the math geeks. Elena felt a lump form in her throat that had nothing to do with the cold. Below her, through the trees, she saw them. The SEALs weren't running away. They had turned their line. They were fighting their way up the mountain, directly into the teeth of the enemy QRF that was hunting her. It was a wall of violence. The 5 able-bodied men moved in a bounding overwatch, their suppressed carbines coughing rhythmically. Foot, foot, foot. They were cutting a lane through the enemy fighters who had been focused on Elena. The enemy didn't expect the prey to bite back. Elena saw a fighter emerge from the brush 20 meters to her left, an AK-47 raised. She didn't have time to aim the rifle. She snapped the pistol up, firing 2 rounds. Pop, pop. The fighter crumpled. Contact left. I'm taking fire, she yelled. On it! A grenade sailed through the air from down the slope, landing near the enemy position. Crump. The blast shook snow from the trees. Suddenly, a hand grabbed her drag strap. She spun around, pistol raised, but stopped. It was Tex. His face was covered in camo paint and sweat, his eyes wide and wild. Let's go, Lieutenant, he roared, grabbing her arm. Taxi's waiting. He didn't ask if she was okay. He didn't ask if she could walk. He just hauled her up and shoved her down the slope behind him. They moved as a single entity now. The team collapsed around her, forming a protective diamond. Rix was being carried by 2 men, his face gray, but he was holding his sidearm, scanning the rear. Go! 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 They crashed through the tree line and hit the valley floor. The sound of rotor blades filled the air. The extraction Chinook, a massive, darker-than-night shadow, was flaring its landing zone 200 meters away. The ramp was down. The miniguns on the side doors spun up, spewing a stream of red tracers into the pursuing enemy on the ridge. Brrrt. The sound was the most beautiful thing Elena had ever heard. They hit the ramp running. Tex threw Elena inside like a sack of potatoes. Rix was tossed in next. The rest of the team piled on top of them. Clear! Lift! Lift! The crew chief screamed into his headset. The bird lurched into the air, banking hard to avoid the RPG fire trailing them from the tree line. The floor tilted. Elena slid across the non-slip decking, slamming into a cargo net. She lay there gasping for air, her chest heaving. The cabin was bathed in red tactical light. The noise was deafening. She looked up. Master Chief Rix was slumped against the bulkhead opposite her. A medic was already cutting away his chest rig, exposing the bloody mess of his uniform. But Rix wasn't looking at the medic. He was looking at her. His eyes were glazed with painkillers and shock, but they were locked on her face. He raised a hand, weak and trembling. He pointed a finger at her, then slowly, deliberately, tapped his temple. Smart. He let his hand drop. His head lolled back. Elena slumped against the wall, clutching the rifle case to her chest. She wasn't just a statistical anomaly anymore. She wasn't just a girl with a calculator. She was one of them. The war ended the moment the ramp of the Chinook touched the tarmac at Bagram, replaced immediately by a different kind of conflict, the bureaucracy. 48 hours later, Lieutenant Elena Vance sat in a chair that was bolted to the floor of a windowless room in the JAG headquarters. The air conditioning was humming a monotonous, headache-inducing drone that was somehow louder than the gunfire in the Palmiers. Across the metal table sat a commander from the Judge Advocate General's Corps and a civilian from the Department of State. The table was covered in files, satellite photos, and the transcript of her radio logs. Lieutenant, the commander said, tapping a finger on a stack of paper, let's review the timeline again. At Oro 200 hours Zulu, you discharged a 50 caliber weapon at a target situated 3,112 meters from your position. Is that correct? Yes, sir, Elena said. Her voice was steady, but her body felt hollow. She hadn't slept. The adrenaline crash had left her feeling brittle, as if her bones were made of glass. And at that time, you had been given a direct order by command to hold fire due to lack of positive identification and cross-border political sensitivity. Is that also correct? Yes, sir. The State Department civilian leaned forward. Lieutenant Vance, do you understand the implications? You fired a high-explosive round into a neighboring country based on a hunch. If you had missed, or if that mortar team had been a shepherd's encampment, we would be dealing with an international crisis right now. You violated the rules of engagement. The team was bracketed, sir, Elena said, her eyes locking onto the civilian's tie. The mortar was adjusting for effective fire. If I had waited for air support, DevGru Element 2 would be coming home in caskets. I made a tactical decision based on immediate threat to life. A tactical decision that defied physics, the commander countered, his tone dry. Ballistics experts at the lab are still arguing about the shot. They say the hit probability was less than 1%. You took a 1 in a million gamble with U.S. foreign policy. I calculated the variables, sir. It wasn't a gamble. It was reckless, the commander snapped. Effective immediately, your rotation with the task force is suspended, pending a formal board of inquiry. You are to surrender your sidearm and your... The door to the interrogation room opened. It didn't creak. It was shoved. The room went silent. Master Chief Bulldog Rick stood in the doorway. He was leaning heavily on a cane, his left arm in a sling, his face a patchwork of bruises and butterfly bandages. He was wearing a hospital gown tucked messily into PT shorts, looking like a wreck. But the aura of command was untouched. Master Chief, the commander said, standing up, you are supposed to be in the ICU. I'm fine, Rix grunted, limping into the room. He didn't look at the officers. He looked at Elena. For a second, his eyes softened, just a fraction. Then he turned to the table. I am submitting an addendum to my sworn statement, Rix announced, his voice gravelly from smoke inhalation. We have your statement, Chief, the JAG officer said. It says you were incapacitated. My statement was incomplete, Rix lied smoothly. I regained consciousness prior to the shot. I assessed the situation. I determined that the enemy mortar posed an existential threat to the unit. I verbally authorized Lieutenant Vance to take the shot. The radio was down on my end, so it wasn't recorded, but the order was given. Elena stared at him. It was a lie. A blatant, career-risking lie. If he was caught perjuring himself, he would lose his pension. Chief, the civilian started, the radio logs show Lieutenant Vance cutting her audio. Faulty equipment, Rix interrupted, slamming his good hand on the table. The environment was hostile. Comms were spotty. The lieutenant acted under my direct authority as the ground force commander. She didn't go rogue. She executed a precision strike that saved 6 Tier 1 operators and secured the objective. Rix leaned in, his face inches from the commander's. You want to court-martial the woman who made the longest combat kill in history to save American lives? Go ahead. But I'll be the first witness for the defense, and I'll bring the whole damn team with me. See how that plays on CNN. The silence stretched, tense and heavy. The commander looked at Rix, then at Elena, and finally at the file. He knew he couldn't win this, not against a SEAL Master Chief who was now a casualty of war. He sighed, closing the folder. The investigation will take the chief's addendum into account, the commander said, his tone resigned. Lieutenant Vance, you are released, pending reassignment. Reassignment? Elena asked. You're too high profile now, the commander said. You can't be a ghost if everyone knows your name. Pack your gear. An hour later, Elena walked out of the admin building into the blinding Afghan sun. A C-130 was taxiing on the runway, dust swirling in its wake. She stopped at the edge of the sidewalk. A group of men were waiting, by a Humvee. Tex, the medic, and the rest of the element. They weren't in uniform. They were in PT gear, looking tired and beaten, but standing tall. Rix was there, leaning against the hood. Elena walked over, stopping a few feet away. She didn't know what to say. Thank you seemed too small. I'm sorry seemed wrong. Rix pushed himself off the hood. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small Velcro patch. It wasn't a unit insignia. It was a custom patch, crudely stitched. It showed a snake wrapped around a ruler. He held it out. "We don't usually give these to support personnel," Rick said, his voice low so only she could hear. "But you aren't support anymore. You're the one who clears the path." Elena took the patch. Her fingers brushed his rough hand. "Thank you, Chief," she whispered. "Don't let it go to your head, Viper." Rick smirked, turning away to hide the respect in his eyes. "You still walk too slow." He limped back to the truck. The team nodded to her, a silent, solemn acknowledgement of the debt that could never be repaid. Elena watched them drive away, disappearing into the dust and the heat of the base. She looked down at the patch in her hand, then up at the distant mountains that loomed over the airfield. She was leaving the team, but she wasn't leaving the war. The shot at the 3,800 meters hadn't just killed an enemy. It had killed the girl who thought she had to ask for permission to be great. She shouldered her bag, turned toward the waiting plane, and walked. She didn't look back.